From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs, and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
And hello, it's another edition of Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm glad you could join us for this edition. As we always do, we talk a little bit about what's going on in the news, and we focus in on something with, we like to try to get some knowledgeable, smart people sitting around the table talk about what's going on, and that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to take on the rather grandiose task of beginning the process of putting together a briefing book for the next mayor. That's our charge here. Somebody is going to replace Richard M. Daley in a few months, and we feel that it's important to have the issues hashed out for this next person so they have an idea what it is that they're facing. And of course, the best way to do that is to start with the budget, because the budget is the document that covers everything. So we've assembled a panel today of people who know a little something about the city budget, and I think you're going to find this interesting. I hope so anyway. Bill Abolt is joining us for a number of years, a couple of years there. Bill was the budget director for the city of Chicago. He's now in private practice and working as an adjunct professor at the University of Illinois. Bill, glad you could join us today. Ben Joravsky back here. Ben Joravsky from the Chicago Reader. And the reason we've invited Ben is because in the last week's edition of the Reader, you may have seen this. He's a personal friend of Mayor Daley's. He gets his picture taken with the mayor a lot. He's also written a number of things about Chicago budgeting, particularly TIFs. Focus on the schools. Good piece in this week's Reader, Ben. Thanks for that. So it'll be interesting to hear that perspective. And also we have with us Michael Pagano today. Michael Pagano is the Dean of Urban Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And Michael brings to the table a kind of an interesting knowledge of how all this fits into the bigger picture, because you've certainly studied the nation, and you've talked about how what we're in for, we haven't even seen what we're in for yet, because other cities it's hit a lot harder and there are cuts to come, and the next mayor is going to have to deal with those. So we also want to talk a little bit about the Jesse Jackson situation, maybe the Governor Quinn situation, a few other things. We'll save those for later on, though. Let's start with you, Mr. Pagano, Dr. Pagano. Are we in trouble?
Are we, the city of Chicago, in trouble?
Okay. Yeah, I mean,
the four of us.
Do we have something to worry about?
We have a lot to worry about.
Well, thanks for coming.
Sure, thank you. That's all. I think we postponed the inevitable, in part because the budget was filled this year with some transfers from the sale of assets, or the lease of assets.
And we know about that.
We know about that.
Yeah.
But most cities around the country didn't have that kind of plug for their budget. So what we've seen nationally is that cities have been reducing personnel. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 or 85% of all cities have actually reduced the number of government employees they have. Almost all of them are cutting back in one way or another, and this is something that has started a year ago. So Chicago sort of got a reprieve because of the transfer of funds into the budget this year. Yeah, and we're in for a big one. I don't know that there's another big transfer of $600 million that we can find to plug the gap.
So when Mayor Daley says it's time, that's what he's talking about. He looked in the budget book and said, I think it's time, right? Because he doesn't want to be the guy who's sitting around chopping everything up.
Oh, I don't know. I think he would have been in a good place to do it, because he's the one I think that has got the ear of the city. But it is time for the city to make some real hard choices about what it's going to be doing in 2011, whether it will be reductions in public safety, or whether it will be, the mayor has already said there will be no new property or increase in the property tax rate, but are there other mechanisms that the city has to generate additional resources so that we don't suffer from a $600 million reduction somewhere, but maybe something less than that. But certainly this will be time to cutting back, identifying where there can be increases in productivity, and finding other places that we can generate additional revenue from.
All right, let's turn to Bill. Bill, you know a little bit something about the budget. You were a former budget director, and I've heard you kind of laying out this scenario of if we took all the revenue pick it up from there. If we took all the revenue that comes in this next year, what could you do with it?
The city has a substantial structural budget problem that has been long-standing, and it's tied to the fact that so much of its budget is tied to personnel, 80+%, and so much of that personnel is tied to police officers, firefighters, and sanitation workers that are picking up garbage. There's a lot of things that are just basic city services that have to be provided. At the same time, when you take the asset sales and set them aside, the city's revenue just hasn't kept pace with the growth of those personnel costs. And the reality is, when you look at the budget gap for the corporate fund, the kind of big fund that's used for police, fire, and sanitation, if you take that gap, you could eliminate virtually every department with the exception of police, fire, sanitation, transportation, which would mean, buildings, animal care, environment. You could make them all go away, and you would just get to the point where the budget was starting to come into balance. So you really have a significant structural problem that has to be addressed. You've got a gap that, per the preliminary budget, is about 20% of the overall budget. It's going to be a real challenge to bring that thing back into balance without either substantial increases in revenue and or substantial reductions in costs and services, particularly focused on a lot of your basic services.
You'll have to help me understand how we got into this mess. Is it just simply because tax revenues went down? I mean, or is it? How were the costs rising? What was it? Was it union contracts?
Again, you've got and this is not the situation in the city of Chicago is not atypical of the situation in other governments. You've got a highly unionized workforce. Your primary cost in running local governments is provision of services, primarily through people. The costs of health care, the costs of other types of benefits go up and up and up. At the same time, there's substantial voter concerns about raising taxes. And there's also been some of the more stable sources of taxes, particularly the property tax, besides the mayor's commitment year after year not to increase the property tax. A good portion of the growth in property tax revenues was siphoned off and sent off into tax increment financing districts that, quite frankly, are not available to for budget balancing. Ben's written a lot of really right-on point articles about a significant growth in tax rate that is kind of out of the reach of policymakers trying to resolve a fairly significant budget issue.
And I don't want to dominate this conversation. I know, Ben, you're itching to get in on this too, but just clarify one more thing for me. Just not a week ago, we had hundreds and hundreds of police officers, standing outside the police department headquarters complaining about the fact that they're, depending on your numbers, 1,000 or 2,000 low in personnel. So the police department is it not true? The police department has many fewer people on its payroll today than it had 2 or 3 years ago.
I don't have the exact head count, but it does underscore a challenge. The majority of the corporate fund budget is police officers and firefighters. Those are positions that maybe are per person or $100,000 a piece in terms of annual expenditure. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be very hard to deal with issues of crime, staffing in the police department, and not have an impact on the rest of the budget. Reality is, given the gap, you'd have to have in the city of Chicago, you'd have to have at least 2 to 3 years of double-digit growth in our revenues. And then after that point, you'd probably have to have 3 to 4% growth in revenues every single year just to keep up with the type of services that we provide now. The stuff doesn't add up. So, whoever the next mayor is, as well as the city council, is going to have to address the significant cost of government, the essential requirement that, what do governments do? Cities are in the health, safety, and welfare business. Keeping the public safe and the people that protect the public safe is clearly job one of the government. That's a substantial expense. How the city is going to meet that expense and do everything else it wants to do is the big issue on the table for this for the next mayor, for the city council. And we got to move beyond we've been having this kind of relatively kind of at the margin superficial discussions. You'll read in the paper, the Sun Times, Fran Spielman will write the article, are we going to privatize or not privatize animal care and control?
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that's a rounding error. Mm-hmm. It's not significant. The issues are much more fundamental, and they're much more focused on what the government has to do in terms of delivery of basic services and how to continue to move the city forward.
Ben, I thought you were jumping in there. So why don't you get in on this? I mean, how do I have this perception as a Chicagoan that things, as far as budget anyway, ran reasonably well for the last 20 years? Everything seemed to always get balanced in the end.
Well,
why are we suddenly in this crisis?
A budget is, aside from being a bookkeeping document, is a political document. Mm-hmm. And so essentially what a budget is a projection. How much money the city expects to bring in and how much it expects to spend. If they bring in less money than they spend, there's a deficit. The greater the deficit is the difference in those two numbers. So it's when a mayor is running for re-election, or when any politician, this is not just exclusive to Chicago or to the state of Illinois, it may be worse in this city, and the state have not done a study. It's always important to project as optimistic a view as he or she legitimately can about the amount of money you'll have to spend, and so there's a tendency to over-project the amount of property taxes you're going to bring in, and then the reality is when you don't bring it in as much as you thought, then you have to make cuts. So I always caution people not to put too much stock in any budget at any given time, because it's a political document. Now in this case, Mayor Daley's not running for re-election, so he's not encumbered in any way from the truth. We have a big deficit. It's not my problem. I'm leaving. It's whatever poor sap follows me into office, okay, has to deal with it. So I guess we're getting a little more truth in budgeting now than we typically get, because the mayor is not running for re-election. I thought that the most artful budget I've ever seen was perhaps in 2006, right before he ran the last time, where he said that the budget was balanced, he had not raised property taxes, and it was his astute management of the entire apparatus of city government, because he's such a great leader, that enabled us to get here, when of course perhaps anybody who understands government knows, one, he had been raising property taxes through the TIFs, and two, he was probably over-projecting the amount of money he was going to bring in. So that's, I think, Ken, in my humble opinion, why we are where we are right now.
Let's do the flip side of this for a moment, if you would. We're talking about, and I think Bill made a good point about it's the health, safety, and welfare function of cities. That's what they're responsible for, and that the largest, if you were to tally up all of the costs of the city, it's police and fire and streets and sanitation. Three big expenditure items. A question I think that it ignores is where, that's on the spending side, that's what a budget is. It's a political document about how much we're willing to put money into, but what it doesn't address is where do the monies come from to fund the budget, and who is bearing the burden? That is, which individual taxpayers are actually paying the costs for streets and sanitation, fire, and police. If you look at the size of, and Bill can tell me the numbers here, if you look at the number of active police and firefighters between the times of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., they're extraordinarily large. They're extraordinarily large because the population of the city is much larger than it is in the daytime than it is at nighttime. And that's because this is a center of employment. The city of Chicago is a large center of employment, as are other cities around the country, and some of them are not. But those that are cities of employment have a lot more costs associated with maintaining health, safety, and welfare during those hours. Now, who pays the cost of police, fire, streets, and sanitation during the hours of 7 a.m. to 7 p.m.? Is it the users of those services, or is it the residents of the city? In the city of Chicago, the tax structure is such that it's primarily the residents of the city that are covering the costs of this enormous employment of police, firefighters, and streets and sanitation during the day hours. So we have, Bill started this by saying that we have a structural imbalance, and I would agree. We have a structural imbalance in that there is demand for services. We want safety on the streets. But the imbalance is, where do we derive our revenues? It's from property, and it's from retail sales. Retail sales is pretty much maxed out at the city level. Most of our retail sales growth in the region has, over the last 20 to 30 years, on a constant dollar basis, has been outside in the collar counties, because that's where the new malls are going in, where there's more growth. The city of Chicago hasn't grown its population very much, and we're hovering around 3 million for a long time now. So there's not that much more retail sales in the city.
And that's where you actually see a substantial change in the city's revenue structure over time, as more and more of the property tax related revenues went to pensions, went to debt,
right.
Got diverted off into the TIFs. The city's primary revenue raising measure in the last decade was to raise the sales tax. So
right.
It became much more dependent on an economically sensitive revenue as a primary source of taxes that is one that is regressive
right.
in its application, and two, that means that you have to be very sensitive to the mix of business that generates that revenue. And if you look at the city's projection of revenue from the sales tax, the actual performance has substantially underperformed.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're going to be more focused on tax sources that are derived from economic activity, we need to be much more aggressive. We need to do a much better job understanding what are the limitations of those revenue sources, and two, to the extent that you can move them forward, you can grow the economy. How do you in fact grow it?
Mm-hmm. And see, this is why, stemming exactly from what you're saying, why it's so important that the public, which this is so wishful, I can't even believe I'm saying this, actually becomes a little more sophisticated about what they're told. Because the reality is that government, as Dr. Pagano said, was far more expensive than we were led to believe, or that we wanted to believe. And so the costs of all those firefighters and police, the police is such a clear case where I've actually gone through the line items where they don't fill vacancies, mm-hmm. Allow retiring officers to retire at a far faster rate than bringing new officers on. So the difference is money that they get to play with to fill the rest of the budget gap. So I think it's time that the public sort of wake up and understand that our government perhaps costs way more than politicians who are running for re-election are allowing us to believe. And it's been going on for a while. This instruction.
Let's focus for a minute on the TIF situation. We've certainly talked about it a lot. Mm-hmm. Ben, you've written about it more than probably anybody. Bill, at this point, is there money that is just kind of like sitting in a pool somewhere? Is there a giant pool of money that has been collected and hasn't been spent?
Ben can describe it better, but there is clearly an awful lot of property tax dollars associated with growth that is sitting there in tax increment financing districts around the city. What is it, about $500 plus million?
We're all dependent on the mayor's budget office for these numbers, and since Bill left, we haven't had a good budget director. Just kidding. But
I was hoping you weren't kidding.
Yeah, no. I mean, I didn't want to insult any of your colleagues who followed.
Okay, all right.
You were. But anyway, so the reality is, I think the last number I saw was $700 million sitting in reserves. That is TIF property tax dollars diverted from all the other taxing bodies to be spent on some sort of development deals, and they're just sitting in a bank account, presumably drawing interest.
And TIFs, the fundamental purpose of tax increment financing, which is to create the opportunity to make investments, to grow the economy and grow the tax base. That's not fundamentally a bad public policy choice, and they can often perform well, but the reality is there is a tremendous amount of money sitting there, and there is quite frankly a lack of kind of transparency. Mm. You can't find TIFs in the budget. It's not part of the budget.
Because they're not in the budget.
If you have that significant amount of revenue, particularly when you're going to be making choices about services, you need to have the debate. It's kind of like Ben was saying, you need to have the debate about it. How can we use the money? If it's going to be used for economic development, what is the return that we expect to receive from it? If it's not going to be used for economic development, what should it be used for, and how would you access it?
That's why I say, we were talking off camera before about whether the city should raid the the asset fund from selling the parking meters. And if I were advising the mayor, not that he would ever listen to anybody like me, even though we are best friends,
Yes,
as you said, Ken,
yeah.
is that I would have rated the TIF funds because they build back. It's money that comes back. Okay, they're diverted into these accounts every year, whereas the parking meter funds is a one-shot deal. So why would you spend the one-shot deal and keep? Why? Because you don't want anybody to get their. You can't spend it all. You have to give a portion of it back to the taxing bodies. So the fact that the TIFs have been off the discussion, have not been part of the public discussion of the budget for the last 4 years, is another big reason why we are where we are now, because it's been sort of a dishonest discussion.
But nobody knows more than you, Ben, that you just can't have this conversation about TIFs because so few people really understand what it is. And I think, I'm just imagining people watching this now and with a kind of a quizzical look on their face, like, what are they talking about?
But I think you can't say, Let me ask you there are hundreds of millions of property tax dollars that are sitting there that need to be part of the discussion.
They've been collected.
That have been collected and will continue to be collected. That can either continue to be used for economic development, and to the extent that they're not used for economic development, would be returned to general city use, to the parks, to the schools. And it's a legitimate discussion to say, well, what are we going to do about that? Particularly if the next step is we have to cut certain services.
Right.
We have to raise additional taxes. If you go back and look historically at just the size of property tax increases, property tax increases, don't generate. They don't generate, $500, $600 million. They don't generate even if the city got $100 million. They generally don't generate that much. So,
but guys, see, this is the thing that. This is where it's focusing my attention. You see a story yesterday, sometimes Tim Mitchell from the Chicago Park District is talking about how they're going to have to do some draconian cuts. They're $22 million out of balance in their budget. The schools, Ben, you just wrote today in the Reader about teachers being laid off like crazy because there's not enough money to pay teachers. That money, the money that fed that big pool of TIF money came from
the schools and the parks.
The schools and the parks.
And see, here's the situation.
So why can't we give $22 million to the parks?
Here's the situation, and this is the real deal. When you have a mayor who's as powerful as our mayor is, who controls the people who run the parks and who controls the people who run the schools, then the people who run those schools and parks will be speaking from the same page. And in this case, they will tell you, if Tim Mitchell were here right now, okay, he would tell you, if Ron Huberman were here right now, he would tell you that the TIF program has been a wonderful program for the Chicago Park District and the Chicago Public Schools, not acknowledging the reality that any one of their budget advisors would tell you off the record that the schools and the parks have lost far more money to the TIF program than they've gained. For every school that Mayor Daley built partially funded with TIF dollars, they gave much more money. So it's a losing proposition. So again, if we go back to our fundamental question, why suddenly are we waking up on the eve of the mayor's resignation or stepping down to realize that our budget is in shambles? It's because throughout the last, I would say, at least 10 years, that's how long I've been looking at it, we've been fooling ourselves about some very important points, one of which is the TIFs, which is, I think it's roughly $500 million a year in property taxes, which is raised by these taxing bodies and sent to funds that they don't control.
So Bill, we're writing this briefing book, Mike Pagano, we're writing this briefing book for the next mayor. What's your recommendation about TIFs? Do we bust them up? Do we go after that money? Do we pull it out and give it to the entities where the money was taken from?
Well, the TIFs were created as an economic development piece. So that the idea behind it theoretically was that in the absence of making this kind of investment, you wouldn't get the growth in those districts, or at least not as much as you would. So was it a good incentive and investment in that area? So that piece of real estate, however however large it was, generates more than it would have afterwards? Very likely. And so it was an investment made by the city. You do lose, the other taxing jurisdictions do lose the tax revenue in the meantime. 23 years is an awfully long time to withhold property taxes from those other taxing jurisdictions. It needs to be revisited. It needs to be made more transparent, though, and I think that's the key to all of this is how much are these TIF districts raising? What are the monies being used for, and how can the public hold the elected officials accountable for the expenditure of that? The second point that I would make, though, is that we're now talking about the current fiscal crisis. We're talking about a current deficit in FY11 that's going to exceed $600 million. What do we do with it? And the point is, sure, we can raid the TIF funds and pull out some of it to plug some of the gaps, or we can have a larger, more important political discussion about what should the best revenue structure for the city of Chicago be. The fiscal architecture for the city of Chicago right now is not generating sufficient resources to supply the services that the citizens, not of Chicago, but of the Chicago region, demand. Not just the city of Chicago. This is a broader regional conversation that we have. If the city of Chicago is going to be the employment center, and we're going to have hundreds of thousands of commuters coming in every day, being protected by our police and by our firefighters, and having access to our streets and our lighting, then we need to have that broader conversation about improving, making a better and more efficient fiscal system for the region.
And the reality is you're going to have a very detailed discussion about the revenue mix. Some of those choices about revenue mix, quite frankly, are not going to be within the control of the next mayor. So the next mayor is going to have to deal with what they can control in terms of taxes and fees. Then there's going to have to be a very focused discussion on the types of services we receive, what's in that bundle of services, and what do we expect to get from them. A very honest discussion about revenue and taxes, as well as priorities in terms of services, may make it very hard for some of the candidates to get elected mayor. But if we have that discussion now, it will make it much easier for whoever is elected to govern, because there are some very difficult choices that are going to have to get made. They are going to relate to basic services, not just small tinkering on the edges. They are going to relate to the taxes that we pay, and everything needs to be on the table to have the right, to get the right decisions made.
We're down to our last 2 minutes. I want to get something kind of specific here. Should the next mayor take some of this available TIF money and invest it in the schools, into teachers? Should the next mayor put that money into the park district?
There's a basic choice of the city giving some of that money back to, if essentially it takes money out, it's going to have to give it back to those jurisdictions. I think fundamentally we need to know how the money is being spent and know why we're spending it in certain ways. There are different strategies that you can employ where you keep the TIF dollars all together. You could invest, we've talked about it before, there's a direct correlation between reduction in crime and improvement in property values. Mm-hmm. Why not in a very target, and you have crime, you have significant crime problems in some areas that are very economically hard hit. To the extent that you have a TIF, why not take some of those dollars and put it towards policing with a specific eye towards violence reduction, with a clear understanding that property values will go up when those communities get safer. It happens.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we're going to have to leave it today. It's one of these conversations that you just kind of get to the point where you're starting to really grasp it and understand it, and your time is up. But I really appreciate these three very knowledgeable people coming by and talking with us today about TIFs, about budget, about where we're going to have to go from here, and what the next mayor is confronting. So thank you, Bill Abolt, former budget director for the city of Chicago. Thank you, Ben Joravsky, for coming back again from the Chicago Reader, and Mike Pagano from the University of Illinois at Chicago. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom right here on CAN TV, and you can see us every week, and I hope you will. Hope you'll watch us regularly. You can find us here on cable. You can also see this and other programs online at cantv.blip.tv. You can check us out there, or you can subscribe on iTunes, which is really cool. I'm Ken Davis. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again next time.